Hello, everyone. Thersites the Historian here. Tonight we are looking at the issue of Confederate cavalry leaders from the American Civil War, and we are ranking them using tier list. And I've created a list here of 13 Confederate cavalry officers. With me to discuss them and rate them is Sean Chick. I will turn it over to Sean so he can explain some basic stuff in just a moment. Quick programming note, you may have noticed that my mic does not sound very good. That's because my mic died and I have only recourse to the internal mic. I have an older mic, but I would have to reinstall it, and that would involve some doing, and I wanted to get this done tonight, so in the future I will have the audio fixed, but right now I'm not going to bother with that. We're just going to soldier through. So, Sean, take it away.
Hey, everybody. So, a few things to know about cavalry in the Civil War. One of the main ones is that it is not going to be used in a lot of ways the way that you would encounter in Europe. So, this isn't like Murat necessarily, or like Seydlitz, who was the Frederick the Great's brilliant cavalry commanders. And the thing is that for them, cavalry a lot had to do with pursuit and being used for charges in battle. Now, that doesn't mean in the Civil War there weren't use of cavalry for pursuit or for charging in battle, but it was much, much more rare. And that's because the American tradition really is more based on the American Revolution. The American Revolution, both the British and American armies there did not use massive cavalry formations. It's because the terrain doesn't really benefit it. It's very, very wooded. In addition to that, it's very expensive to maintain. That doesn't mean that neither force had effective cavalry. The British will eventually have good force. Bannister Tarleton achieves the most fame. For the Americans, it will be Light Horse Harry Lee and William Washington in particular. So one of the ideas for cavalry in the American Revolution was that it would charge infantry, especially if you believed you had an advantage, like Tarleton would oftentimes charge militia with great effect usually. But the other one was that it was used as mobile infantry, scouts, and raiders. And that's an important thing to understand about how do you rate a cavalry commander in the Civil War. So there are really a few things to consider with each officer. And some of these guys will be really good at one thing and not so much of the other one. The four are, in my opinion, one is how good are you at raiding? How good are you going behind enemy lines, disrupting supplies, nabbing up small garrisons, and generally just raising hell? The second one is how effective are you in battle? How effective are you using your men as mobile infantry? There are precious few true cavalry mass charges in the Civil War, but there are lots of cases of cavalry going into battle and fighting like infantry, sometimes in pitched battles. So how effective are you at using them in a battle? The other one is how effective are you at working with your army, particularly in scouting and screening. So what you do in a screen is you're preventing the other side's cavalry from finding your units and bringing back accurate intelligence. While scouting means, of course, that you're trying to get as much accurate intelligence as you can on the enemy's movements. The other one I would say as well is administration. How well you're able to maintain your cavalry forces, keep them organized, keep upkeep with horses as well. And I think those are some of the most important things. It's also a bit about personality. Generally speaking, your cavalry officers are going to be younger than infantry and artillery commanders. They're definitely the type who try to cut a dashing figure, and that's because there's inherently something dashing about the cavalry back then. Hence why there's so many songs about it. Hence why it was very easy for cavalry formations to get recruits as well. In fact, when the Confederates invaded Kentucky in 1862, one of Bragg's complaints was that even though he got recruits from the local Kentuckians, they all wanted to join John Hunt Morgan's cavalry or some other unit, and not go around with what they called the poor bloody infantry.
You remember when we went to Perryville and the reenactors there? All the local Kentuckians showed up with their horses, and then in the reenactment, the horsemen outnumbered the infantry about 2-1.
Yeah, I remember. Oh God, I remember that one Confederate reenactor who rode up. I mean, that guy was perfect.
No, that guy was good, and he was into it. He had like the cocky swag, and he was smoking a cigar, and he had the horsemanship. And then a lot of the other Confederate reenactors, they remember that guy who went down as if he'd been shot, then he got up and he was limping along.
Yeah, God, that was terrible.
And then, they had a bunch of other Confederate reenactors around who were just old fat dudes getting drunk as hell around a fire.
Yeah, my friend Jordan used to do reenacting. He said there was always a argument between those who were like really into the history things. They're only eating hardtack and drinking coffee, right?
Yeah.
And then those who just bringing a case of Bud Light like the day before the battle when you're all camping out, you know?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure if I were doing anything like that, I'd definitely be in the latter category.
Yeah, I could see that. It costs a bit of money to do that stuff, and I'm just not enough into the day-to-day living thing, if you will, because you really got to go like, oh, they do this or that, or knowing the intricacies of drill. That's not really my forte to begin with.
Yeah.
Or as George Carlin would say, fort, but that's a different story. You want to go ahead and get into some of these officers? You got any other questions?
The only other question I would have is when we get to the Union guys in the next video after this, will you be rating them a little differently in terms of the 5 qualities that you talked about, or do you think that the 5 qualities are about equally important for both Confederates and Union cavalry leaders?
Equally important. Oh, keep in mind, I'd say about 4 things to really rate them on. I'm not going to rate these guys as much on charismatic leadership because by the time you become an independent cavalry commander, you pretty much have already set up that you have a level of charisma. You just don't. It's not. There's a few Union guys who aren't particularly charismatic, but you rarely run into that north or south with the cavalry, especially with the Confederates. Almost everybody on this list, regardless of how we're going to rate them, almost all rate highly on charismatic leadership, ability to win over their men, and keep them going. And it should be noted that, and Civil War generals at the time would admit this, Sherman complained about all the time, the Confederates, especially in the first 2 years of the war, have a definite edge in cavalry. They just do. They had a variety of talented leaders who came to the forefront early on. They were also defending their own home, and I believe they had a big advantage on raiding because you could always find friendly locals who would help you out, point you where the Union was, what maybe weaknesses they might have. The terrain as well. Cavalry from Tennessee and Virginia tend to be very effective, and this is not a surprise. Tennessee and Virginia where most Civil War battles happened. Those 2 states, Virginia's number 1, Tennessee's number 2 in terms of number of battles and engagements fought. So the cavalry in those areas, those states provided a lot of cavalry, and those men knew their homes and knew how to exploit that. So they had a variety of advantages that really played up things. But it should be noted, though, by about mid-1864, late 1864 in particular, they are in dire straits, so that's something that should be noted in general about them. So the Union will be a bit of a different experience, a few more officers to go through. But if you're ready to start with the Confederates, then I am.
Oh, just one last little thing. Didn't the Confederates prefer slightly different weapons loadout than the Union guys? Like the Union guys were using mostly carbines, and a lot of the Confederates preferred more up-close weapons, like sawed-off shotguns, or is that more of a generalization?
It's a bit more of a generalization. Some of these guys would use like carbines, even like muskets, but like short muskets, if you will. Repeaters, while a bit rare, were not like unheard of. They would tend to have a few more pistols and shotguns on them, especially early in the war. And that could help if you got surprise on them, right? Because those weapons are deadly at close range. That said, there's plenty of Union units that were outfitted that way. I read about one cavalry unit at the Battle of Nashville that had to go into the fight with only pistols.
Damn.
That's the only weapons they had on hand for them. Yeah, they didn't do too well. I forget the regiment was a Michigan regiment. They didn't do too well. So it does vary up. The Union will have more repeaters as the war goes on. Okay? And that will eventually become an advantage for them, especially in 1864.
I see. I guess by that time also horse health was a major issue.
Horse health is a major issue. Union cavalry organization in the first year or 2 of the war there's no other way to put it, it's abysmal. Confederate organization is not perfect either, but it's it's definitely ahead of what the Union has. And also to the point where there are some battles in the early war where the Confederates definitely outnumber the Union in cavalry, like First Bull Run, Wilson's Creek, 7 Days, Second Manassas, because the Union cavalry is just very poorly organized and distributed in the first 2 years of the war.
Nice.
So Confederates had a lot of advantages, and guys like Rosecrans in particular must be complimented for understanding that their cavalry was a disadvantage, and if they were going to win this war, they had to make their cavalry as good as possible. And Rosecrans did. That's one of his major accomplishments to the Union war effort.
All right, so we have 13 generals to look at, or actually 13 officers. A couple of them actually aren't generals. And then I have 2 extra blank profiles that will come available on the screen in a minute. Those are just in case we happen to leave anybody off the list, and then we want to have a stand-in. So they're not there by accident, in case anybody's wondering. We'll start out with the first officer, Rosser.
Gotcha. Oh, one little correction. All these men made general.
Really?
That we have here. Yeah, they all made general. Now, some of them didn't make general for a while, but they all made general.
Okay.
Okay? Yeah. So we're going to start with Rosser. I'll confess this is the one I know the least about, but Rosser was one of the right-hand men of Fitzhugh Lee and Jeb Stuart. A very popular and competent officer. He excelled at regiment and brigade command. By the time you get to about mid-1864, he's going to start to command a division. He did very well at Trevelyan Station. His only real independent command was commanding a division in the Shenandoah in late 1864. And he fought a battle at Tom's Brook, where he was defeated. And this was considered one of those signal points where the Union cavalry really started to understand that they were now becoming much better than the Confederate cavalry. Rosser effectively commands one of the 2 cavalry divisions under Jubal Early. Jubal Early, by the way, blamed the Confederate cavalry consistently for his woes in the valley. And while the Confederate cavalry is in bad shape by this time, it seems to me obvious that Rosser's a bit out of his depth. He's not really capable of division command. The most notorious moment comes at Five Forks. He's the one who tells Fitzhugh Lee and Pickett about the fish fry that they go off to try to enjoy.
Oh, that was him. Oh, God.
That was it. Rosser was the guy, and that makes sense. He looks like kind of a pudgy guy from over here, Anyway, I would say about Rosser that if we were rating him based on regiment and brigade command, he would definitely be an A or a B. But independent command, while we don't have a lot of evidence, what he showed wasn't too impressive. I got to give him a D.
Okay. Sounds about right. Next up, we have someone who's probably better known as a corps commander, Stephen D. Lee.
That's right, Stephen D. Lee, the only Confederate officer, one of the only ones I know of, to during the war command artillery, cavalry, and infantry.
And he's also not related to Robert E. Lee, right?
Not really. I think I read something sometime where he might be a distant relative, but I'm foggy on that. I believe he is not related. Stephen D. Lee was told, one of my history professors, Harry Laver, described Stephen Lee as the Forrest Gump of the Civil War. He just shows up everywhere. He was a very affable guy, very good at winning friends, very optimistic man, too. He's the man who delivered the surrender papers to Fort Sumter, by the way, the demand for surrender. He commanded artillery in the Army of Northern Virginia at 2nd Manassas and Antietam, did very well. For that reason, he was sent to Vicksburg because Vicksburg had a lot of artillery. They wanted an artillery expert there. While he's at Vicksburg, he eventually commands some infantry, does pretty well. He is then put in charge of the Confederate defenses in Mississippi, which is mostly a cavalry command. His immediate subordinate is Forrest. Now, the only battle that Lee commands this cavalry force in is Tupelo. Tupelo is a completely bungled affair. The attacks failed. Forrest blamed Lee, and Lee probably wasn't. Lee probably did kind of bungle that one. He didn't show any particular skill with cavalry. He later on, of course, commanded infantry corps in the Army of Tennessee. Sorry, in the later stages of the war. Lee didn't show any particular aptitude for cavalry operations. He wasn't particularly aggressive outside of Tupelo, as far as I know. He was a bit more concerned with defense, but in defense of his actions, that makes some sense. What the Union's trying to do in Mississippi is attack Confederate supply depots and, most importantly, grain. The Mississippi-Alabama interior really is feeding the Confederate Army at this point. And so that defense is successful in maintaining that supply. Although at the same time, those attacks make sure that Forrest and other men are kept from raiding Sherman's rear. Now, the effect that a raid on Sherman's rear would have is debatable. There's a lot of evidence now that shows that Sherman had already stockpiled so many supplies at Chattanooga that his army could have survived with the rail line broken for a fairly long period of time. But that said, any damage that they could have done to Sherman's supply lines was negated by the Union attacking into Mississippi and arguably by Stephen Lee not being particularly aggressive. I would rate him as a cavalry commander an E.
That bad, huh?
Yeah, he's a good artillery commander, by the way. Artillery-wise, he'd be an A or a B. He just didn't show any particular aptitude for it.
I see. All right. Next up, we have John A. Wharton.
Yeah, John A. Wharton commanded Terry's Texas Rangers, 8th Texas Cavalry, commands them at Shiloh very effectively. Wharton is one of the most arrogant commanders on this list. Most men found him insufferable, but he was also considered very good at his job. Now, he commands that regiment, eventually a brigade, and then a cavalry division under Wheeler. He did very well at the screening and scouting job. Like, he kept up a good cavalry screen, wasn't really bested in that regard. Not too much tested in raiding, by the way. Didn't really take part in that many raids, honestly. As far as the battlefield goes, showed himself to be very effective. His main defect would be arrogance. In fact, he was murdered right around the war ended by a Colonel Baylor in Texas. Wharton's stint in independent command is when he commands the cavalry in Louisiana and Texas after the Red River Campaign, after the death of Tom Green. He really wasn't tested. The war wound down in that area, but it should be said that Wharton was able to maintain his command pretty well. Everything would tell me that he should have at least been a solid commander. I'll give him a C. And some of that lowering is that probably of all the commanders on here, he's the least charismatic of the bunch.
Really? Also, you said he was murdered by someone named Baylor. Do you remember the circumstances of that?
He had insulted Baylor, so Baylor walked into the hotel room and shot him. I believe Baylor was never convicted or anything, by the way. I could be wrong about that one, though. Don't quote me on it, but I believe Baylor got away with it. But there's that old saying in Texas, a horse never deserves to die, but sometimes a man does.
Wow. I've never heard that one before. Then I guess I haven't really been to Texas, so.
Oh, God. You ever watch that documentary about Robert Durst, the guy who murdered his wife and friend? He's a serial killer guy. They actually caught him in New Orleans at the Mahogany Jazz Hall. But anyway, I mentioned him because he murdered a guy in Texas, and one of the ways they got him out of the murder charge was his defense lawyers, which he hired very good ones because he's wealthy, were able to convince the jury that the guy he murdered was a jerk.
Damn.
Yeah.
Well, that's a novel defense.
Yeah, it seems to have worked for Baylor and Jefferson C. Davis when he shot Nelson. That's the Union's infamous example of murder.
Oh shit.
Yeah.
And you said that was when they shot Nelson. That was the time when everybody knew and no one cared.
Yeah, I mean Jefferson Davis shot Nelson in front of everybody in the hotel room, and he said it's because he had been insulted. Jefferson Davis is never brought to trial at all. Partially it's because Davis is protected by Governor Morton of Indiana, and also Nelson was allied to Buell, and at that time Don Carlos Buell's reputation is falling apart.
Oh yeah.
In the case of Wharton, it must be said that he had probably not. He just didn't have enough friends, I would guess. I mean, one of the reasons he ended up in Texas was Joseph Wheeler, his superior, was pretty sure Wharton was angling for his job. So he was kind of like, we got to get this guy out of here, which is a problem because Wharton is probably Wheeler's best division commander, and Wheeler's cavalry will never operate as effectively again after Wharton leaves. I mean, it was already in the decline, but it'll never operate as effectively again.
Huh.
The guy definitely knew his business when it came to the cavalry.
All right. Well, how about Thomas Green, his predecessor?
Yeah, Tom Green, not too well known by a lot of historians. I mean, or a lot of Civil War historians, but who's Tom Green? Because he pretty much served almost exclusively west of the Mississippi. He commands the cavalry in the 1863 to 64 under Richard Taylor. Richard Taylor praised him a lot in his memoirs. These two men got along very, very well. Um, Tom Green was effective at raiding the Union, attacking their outposts. One thing he was also known for was setting up cannons on the Mississippi River and shelling Union gunboats. He was very good at that. Red River Campaign, he keeps great tabs on Banks's men, gains superiority over his cavalry, and his cavalry plays a leading role in the victory at Mansfield. Tom Green, though, did eventually die. That said, he proved to be an exemplary cavalry commander in just about every way possible. I give him an A.
Yeah, but no Murat here.
Nobody's going to be Murat here because nobody on here ever led some mass charge that worked, you know?
Yeah, I guess that's fair. But also, one thing you forgot to mention about Tom Green was his 2001 comedy "Freddy Got Fingered." That was pretty successful at the time.
Oh yeah, yeah, great movie, man. I kind of like that movie because it's out there.
It is.
You know?
I want to rewatch that soon. I haven't seen that in a long time.
I was told it was like the worst movie ever, and I watched it. Maybe because I've seen like The Room and Samurai Cop and a bunch of other. I mean, well, actually, those movies are at least watchable. I've seen worse stuff than that. Like, hey, viewers out there, you want to watch the worst movie ever made? Watch Howling 7.
Or watch the Starfighters without the Mystery Science Theater comments.
Yeah, that's a rough one too, man. Movies like No Holds Barred at least like keep moving at a pace. The Room, the one thing you say for The Room is it's unique and things happen.
Yeah, things keep happening. You don't get bored.
Yeah, exactly. The Starfighters and Howling 7, they're boring. They're bad and boring.
Also,
But
a lot
anyway,
of other movies like that, Beastie Yucca Flats, and a lot of those Mystery Science Theater ones, like if it wasn't for the commentary, those movies would be literally unwatchable. And those guys said they had to spend about, what, 60 hours preparing to get all their jokes timed? I mean, fuck. Can you
yeah.
imagine watching that much of those things?
Well, I remember one guy, Frank, TV's Frank, because he was the guy watching the movies. He said there were ones that were worse than what we showed, is
Oh,
what he said.
God.
Yeah, he said there were movies that were worse than what we showed, where literally nothing happened. You know.
I remember
Oh yeah.
one of the most famous MST3K lines is, well, this movie started nowhere and stayed there. Yeah. And also, I don't know if I told you, but I actually met TV's Frank and then the original Dr. Forrester, Trace Boulot. And I have a picture with the two of them and also Tina.
Yeah, I went there. They've been to New Orleans twice. I've seen them both times. Bought Trace Below's book. Really, really fun aside though, Danny. They had the Q&A, people asking questions. A lot of the questions were kind of dumb, right? And then Danny had a question. His question was, what was one of the movies you saw that you found you kind of liked? When he asked that, they were both kind of like, what? And they were like, wait, that's a good question. Because Danny's opinion is Q&As are stupid 90% of the time. But I was like, dude, ask it. That's a good question. And they were actually like, they answered it. And they were like, that's actually a good one. Trace, I forgot TV's Frank answer, but Trace Below's answer was the shorts. He loved the shorts.
I remember when there was somebody who asked a similar question at the one I was at in Columbus, and they said that even though they make fun of these movies and these movies are bad, that they do have a certain love for all of them, even the ones which are, painful. And I guess part of it's
Yeah.
because that's how they made their living, but also, I mean, they're legit lovers of film in all forms, so.
I mean, just what do you think's better? Like one of these like colorless, boring Disney Star Wars movies or The Room? I'll watch The Room any day of the week.
Yeah, or actually, I'm not even kidding. I would rather watch Transmorphers again than watch Transformers again.
Yeah, exactly. It's funnier and In the end, in some ways, it's got more heart.
It does. I
Well,
mean,
no,
like you remember in the original
Groom
Transmorphers, like
does.
it was clear that all the girls they got to be their fighter pilots were just like local strippers who had no idea how to act. And then they got into a little locker room fight, and they're talking about flying their things and speaking in a monotone like they just learned their lines 10 minutes before. I mean, this is I think that's epic filmography right there. That's film history. You can't fake that. You can try to act it, but you can't fake it.
Well, let's get back to our generals
Right,
before
right.
we
That's what we're here
derail
for.
before we
Um,
derail with our mutual love of bad filmmaking, man.
yeah, that could be a whole video or a
It could
series, a
be.
whole book.
I'll say one last thing. If you need a list of some stuff, I mean, check out Danny's. Go to Danny's Facebook page. He did reviews for all the movies that he watched last year,
All
which he's
right.
got some classics on there, man.
Yeah, I have to talk. I have to look at that. Also, if we do a bad movie video, we'll have to get Danny to come in for that.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Anyway,
Also,
let's get on back.
so our
Tom,
next, yeah.
I
So
will say Tom. I will say one thing about another thing about Tom Green. There's not a lot of colorful anecdotes about the guy, but just about everybody said he was one hell of a fighter. Like, definitely not the kind of guy you want to walk into a bar room and be pissed off at you.
well, that's always probably a good thing if you have to fight in the Western theater where supplies are short and everything else.
Yeah.
All right. Next guy on the list is John S. Marmaduke.
Yeah, he's I'll be straight up, man. He's one of my least favorite officers on this list. Marmaduke started off commanding infantry, commanded an infantry regiment at the Battle of Shiloh, did pretty well there. Eventually gets sent west of Mississippi and eventually becomes their main cavalry commander. He is notorious for shooting and killing one of his subordinates. I believe his name was Walker. They got into a duel. Marmaduke, by the way, um, lamented this the rest of his life. Marmaduke, as a cavalry commander, showed no particular aptitude or skill. He commanded the cavalry in Arkansas and Missouri, and he was below average at best. Usually, when called upon to win in a big cavalry fight, he usually lost, like, say, Westport. Um, yeah, I give the guy like an E. I
Yeah.
think the cavalry in Arkansas and Missouri would have benefited from somebody else in charge,
Is,
preferably the guy who comes after him.
is Marmaduke the guy you told me died was also shot after the war because he was banging somebody's wife or something?
No, that's Van Dorn, and that
Oh,
was
okay.
during the war. We'll get to Van Dorn in just a little bit.
All right. Um, Next up is Joseph O. Shelby.
Joseph Shelby commanded what was called the Iron Brigade. He is Marmaduke's right hand man. He commands an elite cavalry brigade. He's pretty good in a fight. Um, he launched a raid into Missouri in 1863 that was considered one of the most successful and destructive raids of the American Civil War. Shelby was superb. He would probably, I'd have to say, he was good in a fight. He's good at raiding. His scouting information is pretty solid as well. I'm going to give Shelby a B.
Okay.
One of the other interesting things about Shelby was that he rode south when the war is over. He is one of the Confederates who says, I am not surrendering. So he rides south to Mexico and he lived there for a few years. He then returned to Missouri and became a successful politician. And there was a biography written about him maybe 10 years ago, which said that by that time, Shelby had started to renounce and even feel guilty about the Confederate cause that he had been willing to run to Mexico for. Interesting thing with that. I should probably read a bit more about Shelby, but everything that I have read about him, very, very good commander. Probably the best one west of Mississippi outside of Tom Green.
All right. So I guess they of the three so far we've looked at west of the Mississippi, two of them have been pretty damn good.
Yeah, in West Mississippi, Confederate cavalry really did have the edge there, even a bit longer. Well, no, actually, no, that's a misstatement. Their cavalry was declining by the time they invaded Missouri. But in the Red River campaign, yeah, Confederate cavalry dominates the field in that instance.
So I guess was the transmiss was that department in general a little bit better commanded than some of the others, or like if you had to compare it just in broad strokes to the Eastern and Western theaters in terms of
But
total command competence?
It's half and half. I mean, they'll benefit from having guys like Taylor, Green, and Magruder who are good at their jobs. But then again, the overall commander's Kirby Smith. He's not really particularly special. Holmes was there for a bit. Sterling Price was there. Sterling Price was a hit and miss commander, to be fair, though. The Trans-Mississippi, I think one of the Confederate advantages there was they did have guys like Taylor there for a while, but also they were not fighting the Union's A team. I mean, the Trans-Mississippi is a very important theater 1861 to early 1862. And that's because they're trying to secure Missouri and capture New Orleans. After that, the theater is essentially, I hate to say a sideshow, but it's secondary, tertiary to the other theaters that are going on. The Union will put resources into it. There are talented commanders there like Samuel Curtis. And the biggest Union offensive in the area is the Red River Campaign, which had multiple objectives, one of which was to strengthen the Union in the area in order to essentially threaten Mexico, because Mexico at this time had been taken over by a French expedition, and they put the Emperor Maximilian there. And French interference in Mexico, violates the Monroe Doctrine. Plus, the Mexican government favored the Confederacy and traded with them quite a bit. So the Union efforts, a lot of the Union efforts in the Trans-Mississippi, starting in 1863, are about securing the Mississippi River and showing Mexico that they're not going to give up. That they're taking the threat seriously, and they do not want the Mexicans expanding into American territory or helping the Confederates out more than they already are, which eventually leads to a major Union expedition to take Brownsville, Texas in 1863. But once the Red River Campaign is over, the Trans-Mississippi starts to get pretty quiet pretty fast. But that doesn't mean it's not interesting, fascinating. And while its effect on the overall war might be more slight, its effect on the West, on Western expansion, is big. A lot of your gunfighters of the Old West are going to be men from the North and the South. The gunfight, the OK Corral, in many ways, was a fight between pro-Union and pro-Confederate men, and the effect it'll have on Western migration as well. So not an unimportant theater for America or its history, but not the decisive theater of the war, certainly.
All right. That's a good breakdown. Next up, we have Earl Van Dorn.
Yeah, we went over him a bit, but we were talking about him as an independent commander of a Confederate army, to which we were like, this guy's terrible. Well, here's the funny part. Van Dorn, before the war, was considered one of America's premier cavalry commanders. But when the war starts, he is a Mississippi planter, comes from the aristocracy. He's friends with Jefferson Davis, so he's assured a high command. He commanded an infantry corps in Virginia, didn't see any action before he shipped out west. The thing is, by after Pea Ridge, during the siege of Corinth, a general named Liddell, who wrote excellent memoirs, actually talks about going to Van Dorn and saying, hey, you're a great cavalry commander before the war. Why don't you take over our cavalry and lead a major raid to the Union rear? And Van Dorn dismissed him in the most arrogant way possible, because that would be beneath him. Well, after Corinth, that's a failure. The battle, well, not the siege, it's now the Battle of Corinth, where Van Dorn tries to take place, gets defeated. He then conceives of a cavalry raid. You see, Grant was advancing on Vicksburg from the north over land. That's a very tenuous supply line. So Van Dorn essentially goes to General Pemberton and says, if I raid Grant's rear and destroy a supply depot, especially at Holly Springs, we can stop this attack. Pemberton said, I'll do it, but only if you'll lead the cavalry in. Now, Van Dorn at this point knows that his reputation is pretty low. He was in charge of an independent army, and he's been superseded. So I think at that moment, Van Dorn, to his credit, was like, you know what? If I'm going to be any use to anybody, I'd better do this. So he commands a cavalry on one of the most effective raids of the Civil War, the destruction of Holly Springs Depot and the capture of its garrison. This is one of the reasons why Grant does not take Vicksburg in early 1863. After that, Van Dorn led his cavalry north to Bragg, And this gives Bragg, actually, in 1863, early 1863 to mid 1863, Braxton Bragg commands the largest concentration of Confederate cavalry of the Civil War, some 15 to 18,000 men in two corps. One corps led by Wheeler, one corps led by Van Dorn. Van Dorn does pretty well in his early fights with the Union cavalry. Most famously, his cavalry captures a Union infantry brigade at Thompson's Station. And understand, infantry losing to an all-cavalry force is almost unheard of in the Civil War. Now, people hear that, and they're like, well, the cavalry has repeaters. This is true, but the cavalry is not really taught to fight in a sustained firefight. And also, you don't necessarily want to lose your cavalry in those kind of fights, because to train someone to effectively ride and use a horse takes a lot of time. Cavalry training is much more intensive, so you don't want to throw away your men. But Van Dorn, along with Forrest, are able to capture this brigade. It's arguably the tactical high point of the Confederate cavalry in the West. But then Van Dorn gets into trouble. Him and Forrest start to not like each other. And then, of course, remember, Van Dorn is a real ladies' man, as he was called, the terror of ugly husbands across the South. He was caught sleeping with this guy's wife, maybe his daughter as well. Once again, I still got to read the book on that, called Where Elephants Fought, I believe. Point is, Van Dorn is murdered by the jealous husband, who, by the way, is not prosecuted either.
Damn.
In fact, his wife that he was diddling with, they made up, and then she died. They're buried next to each other, you know.
Oh, wow.
The death of Van Dorn essentially leads to Forrest taking over command of the corps, and we'll get to how he does with that a little later. But it's a major blow to the Confederate cavalry. Van Dorn, for all of his personal failings, was a very effective leader of horse. Let's see. He's good on a raid. He's pretty good in a scrap. His scouting information he wasn't too tested in. I'm going to give him a B.
Okay. Sounds about right. So I guess this does go to show that you can be skilled at one thing and not others, even within the same war.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, Stephen Lee should have stayed in the artillery, right?
Yeah.
Thanks, talent.
All right. Our next individual is John Hunt Morgan.
Yes, John Hunt Morgan, flamboyant, charismatic, songs and poetry written about him. Morgan and his Raiders. I had actually grew up hearing about that, not from my dad, but from my mom, because John Hunt Morgan had raided southern Indiana, so he was still kind of part of the local lore of that region, even to my mom's generation, So John Hunt Morgan starts the war off commanding a small but very elite cavalry outfit. He did extremely well in the War of Outposts, so, overrunning like a Union squad or a Cavalry of the Dead or whatever. For instance, when the Confederates are evacuating Nashville and the Union's following them, one of the reasons that they don't follow them very effective is that Morgan's cavalry would attack the followers and round up prisoners. He fought the Battle of Shiloh, did pretty well there with this small outfit. After that, he's given... Essentially, he takes a small brigade, has a very effective raid against the Union rear, Don Carlos Buell's rear, and then takes part in the invasion of Kentucky. His high point is when he captures a Union infantry garrison at Hartsville, Tennessee. And when he returns, he is promoted from colonel to general by Jefferson Davis himself.
Damn.
Morgan then led another effective raid into Kentucky during the Stones River campaign. And then here's where his downfall comes. He is now made commander of a division. Now, there's an argument about what happens with Morgan. At this point, he starts doing very poorly. His cavalry screen gets penetrated repeatedly by the Union. He is almost captured on one occasion. His men lose several battles. So it's obvious Morgan is losing a step. Now, why that is, there were two things said. One was that Morgan had married a woman, and that she was essentially, that married life was sapping his martial energy. And it should be noted that when the war started, he was married, but that marriage had gone very poorly. He was known as a gambler and a womanizer. So he's essentially just like a bachelor running around, and then he gets married to this young bride, and people would say that took the fighting spirit out of him. I don't necessarily buy that. I think a division was beyond his mental abilities.
Hmm.
I, I think he was foremost a raider and a regiment to a brigade commander who became so famous and renowned they just promoted a division. He just wasn't good at managing his men. Well, Morgan felt so humiliated that he got Bragg's permission to launch a raid north of Nashville. But Bragg, here's what happens. Bragg tells him, okay, good idea, because Bragg would tell you Morgan's a great raider. He says, but if the Union attacks me, it looks like they're going to any day now, and I fall back, I need you to attack their rear. And Morgan said, sure thing. When the Union offensive starts, Morgan ignores that and just keeps going north. This is one of the silliest, craziest, most entertaining and psychotic things any Civil War general's done. He raids north, crossing into Kentucky, raiding Indiana and Ohio. Tried to recross the river, couldn't, and was captured. Most of his command was essentially destroyed. But
Damn.
this long raid is crazy and pointless. It doesn't really have much effect in the Union war effort. Its only positive effect for the Confederates is it happens right around the time of Vicksburg, Port Hudson, and Gettysburg. So it did raise morale in the South. They were like, well, even though this is happening, Morgan's up there raising hell. But eventually Morgan's command is, like I said, captured and essentially taken out of the war for a bit. Morgan does return. He's never again given a truly major command, and he dies in a skirmish. It's a bit hard to rate Morgan. It's kind of like Rosser. If we were just talking about brigade or regiment commander, he'd be like an A. Once he was given division and he had independent responsibilities, it was beyond his abilities. I give him an E.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds about right. I remember when we lived in Lexington, there's also the house he grew up in, the John Hunt Morgan house. But you
Yeah.
said that he had a lot of charisma, so I'm surprised that Kentucky remembers him because charisma does not work in Kentucky.
Maybe not nowadays, right?
Yeah, maybe Kentucky
Um,
was much different in the 1860s, and people there actually had facial expressions and you know undertones in their voice and other things like that.
so there was a statue to him, and I believe John Breckinridge in Lexington, Kentucky. They both got removed. But I saw Mark Summers gave a talk, and he was opposed to statue removal. And in the case of Morgan, he said it's a funny statue because he's on the wrong horse.
Yeah, I guess you could make a you could also make an argument that he kind of helped reunify the country by leading a division to its destruction. So
Well, then you'd be like those guys I saw online who were like, one guy was like, the best general the Union had was Robert E. Lee. What an idiot. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. Robert E. Lee, what a loser. So
who
many battles, right?
who said that?
I'm telling you, man, there's a whole thing right now where people are like, Grant's a military genius and Lee's an idiot. I run into it all the time.
So like of all the Confederate commands, the only one who didn't lose ground for a really long time would have been Lee, right? So
Well, I,
how does
well,
that
I
help the
think,
Union by him holding Richmond for 2 or 3 years? I don't.
well, it's tied to two things, really. On the one hand, a lot of these people don't understand warfare in the era, so they don't understand that what Lee accomplished was quite amazing for the time. The other one is that the Civil War is still for people like a team sport, and especially one where you find like your team player you like best, and that becomes your guy, and your guy never did anything wrong. So Grant's very popular right now. And you'll almost always find that people who really like Grant are very critical of Lee and vice versa. I think it's infantile personally.
It is.
These are men who have strengths and weaknesses. I've yet to find one who did not have any weaknesses and made no mistakes. And the denigration of Robert E. Lee's military abilities to me is it just kind of seems a lot of times like playground childishness. I do have some critiques of Lee. They're in the other video, but he's definitely not incompetent.
Yeah. Wow. It amuses me too that there are people who still get so personally invested in how good a general from 150 years ago was. That their pride is swept up in how good someone's tactical planning was over a century before they were born.
Yeah. Well, their contention is Lee was a bad strategist, which I say that Lee's a better strategist than they give him credit for, but not a great one, but a better one than he gets credit for. That's my opinion, you know. But that's in the other video. We maybe talk more about that in detail another time.
But for now, we have.
Oh, you want to get to Wheeler then?
Yeah, we have someone who actually I know more about his service in the Philippine War. Interestingly enough, Joseph Wheeler.
Yeah, funny you mention that. He is one of only 2 Confederate generals buried in Arlington National Cemetery.
Huh.
The other one is Marcus Wright, and that's because Marcus Wright actually worked for the War Department after the Civil War, and in particular, Marcus Wright was instrumental in compiling the Confederate records from the Civil War. So Marcus Wright was not a very good general, by the way. He eventually got removed from command. There were some accusations of cowardice. But I will say, like, as far as for us historians, Marcus Wright is one of the greatest Confederate generals ever. I mean, thank you for your service, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, Joseph Wheeler, of course, gets that because he does become a U.S. general during the Spanish-American War. That was when the country's really starting to reunite and look into the 20th century as a united country that's eventually, with the Spanish-American War, we're going to become an empire. That's when we become an empire of territories. A true blue empire, if you will, at least like in the colonial sense. But anyway, point is that Wheeler served in the U.S. Army in the Spanish-American War, and I don't know about his service in the Philippines, but I know his service in Cuba, he did well. I would say better than he did as a Confederate general.
Yeah, that's the impression I got too from the Philippine War, because I know he led infantry there. He was doing really well in combat, but apparently he technically disobeyed an order, even though it didn't lead to any negative consequences. He also had a somewhat high casualty rate because he was aggressive. He was considered over-aggressive, but he was getting the job done. And then one of his superiors was an old Union guy, and he was looking for an excuse to sack Wheeler, because apparently, despite the fact that Wheeler was about 64, 65 by this point, he was still full of piss and vinegar and eager to get at the enemy. And
yeah, I forgot the name of I can't pronounce the name. It's like Las Galanas or something. It's the opening engagement of the landing in Cuba. Wheeler did very well there, but apparently, when they had the Spanish army on the run, he yelled, "We have the damn Yankees on the run." So Wheeler was extremely young. I mean, he's gonna be in his 20s, one of the youngest generals on this list. He actually gets the nickname the War Child. Aggressive, humorless, like just couldn't really tell a joke or take a joke very well. Energetic as well. Now, Wheeler commanded an infantry regiment at Shiloh, did very well, exceptionally well. He then eventually gets command of a small cavalry brigade in the invasion of Kentucky. He does very well there, too. He helps screen the army at Perryville. While he overstated his role, his cavalry definitely played a part in delaying a key Union advance at Perryville. He led the rear guard, the retreat from Kentucky, did very well there. And all of those actions, and plus the fact that he had served with Bragg since 1861, meant Bragg really liked him. So Bragg makes him commander of the cavalry division, and then at Stones River, Wheeler went around Rosecrans and destroyed one of the supply wagons. Essentially, he destroyed a third of Rosecrans' supplies. This is one of the reasons why Stones River isn't, while it's a successful Union advance in battle, it could have been more, but Rosecrans didn't have the supplies. He had lost so much from Wheeler's cavalry. Now, after Stones River, Wheeler made a foolish attack on Dover, Tennessee, near where Fort Donelson was located. That didn't really go anywhere. Him and Forrest disagreed with each other at that time and decided to keep out of each other's way. But Wheeler did lead some successful raids against Rosecrans, but here's where things started to get a little bad. His cavalry screen is defeated in the opening of the Tullahoma campaign. Then comes a battle called Shelbyville, which when I found out about it, I was like, wait, how come no one ever spoke about this? This is an extremely dramatic and important battle. Now, the thing about Shelbyville is it's awesome it's not even listed as a Civil War battle. But what happened is Wheeler's cavalry is being pushed down by David Stanley's. Within the town of Shelbyville, Wheeler tried to make a stand. The Union cavalry actually charged, overran, and captured Wheeler's cannons and a large number of his men. Wheeler only escaped by diving his horse into the Duck River.
Damn.
Yeah. Wheeler barely escapes. The battle in some way showed him at his best because he fought hard. He led a few charges himself to try to recover the situation. So if anything, his reputation amongst his men went up for bravery and skill in just battle. But it is a defeat, a major defeat. It is the first time that I know of where Confederate cavalry fought Union cavalry and were not just defeated, but routed from the field practically. So the Union cavalry's morale skyrockets. Now, Wheeler continues to command this cavalry corps. He does very poorly in the Chickamauga campaign with screening and whatnot. After Chickamauga, he was sent on a large raid of the Union rear. The effect of this raid is debated. A lot of historians say it was a failure because with Wheeler gone, Bragg didn't have good intelligence, and Wheeler didn't cause enough destruction. I'll say that he did cause a lot of destruction, but the raid did wear out his command. So while the raid wasn't a true failure, it was a bit more like a Pyrrhic victory, if you will. Still, Wheeler will command the cavalry corps in the Atlanta campaign. He did pretty well at screening and scouting in that one, and that's really to his credit because by that time he's running low on men, and that's because of horses. And this is Wheeler's big defect. He is awful at administration and discipline. His men become notorious as looters. There used to be a saying in Georgia and South Carolina that the only thing worse than Sherman's army was Wheeler's cavalry.
Damn. That's saying a lot.
Yeah, I mean, bad discipline, start to become known for looting. Wheeler led a raid into Sherman's rear that was a complete failure. During Sherman's march to the sea, his cavalry was supposed to try to contain Sherman's men. Arguably, Wheeler did restrict Sherman's operations in Georgia more than his numbers should have allowed. He got into a few fights with Sherman's cavalry, which could go either way. Sometimes he would win, sometimes he would lose. But overall, Sherman's cavalry was able to defeat him a few more times than he was able to beat them. So Wheeler's something of a hard one to rate because his initial time in independent command, he was very effective. But when he declines hard. That said, even then in 1864, he'd have his moments, and it was a tough spot. I'll give him a D.
Okay. That sounds about right. So, speaking of opposing Sherman's march, I guess he and Hardee would have been working together. Who actually did more to slow Sherman down?
Probably Wheeler. I mean, his men would capture Sherman's scouts and raiders and bummers. The bummers are the guys who would go out to, steal stuff.
Ah.
Hardee was too busy trying to organize the defenses of Savannah, which were very strong, by the way. The thing about Savannah, Georgia, is that if Sherman had attacked it, it may or may not have fallen. Now, Hardee's disadvantage is he's outnumbered, and his men are mostly like militia garrison troops. That said, the fortifications were extensive. The terrain was horrible to attack through. I mean, swampy. And one thing Hardee had a lot of was artillery. A lot of artillery. Sherman didn't, though. Sherman had been traveling light with artillery. Sherman would have probably tried to besiege the place, and he was receiving some siege guns, but Hardee did about as well at Savannah as he could. Wheeler at no point really exactly slowed Sherman down,
Right. I guess he didn't have quite enough manpower to really put a stop to a whole army, though.
Yeah, and furthermore, his cavalry's in bad shape, and he's not really the best the Rebs have,
How good was he at coordinating with army commanders?
It would vary. He seemed to be pretty good in the Atlanta campaign, and he's pretty bad in the Chickamauga one from what I've read. Yeah, I'll give him a D just because he was very effective in his first few months, and he would still have some good moments even later in his career.
All right, and I guess, too, because he was young, and then also because he was still clearly physically viable 30-plus years later, I guess there's no question of him having some sort of physical decline or anything like that impeded his performance.
Yeah, no. And, keeping in mind, these men tend to all be on the younger side to begin with. But no, I mean, Wheeler wasn't great by any means. He's probably in some ways like John Hunt Morgan. He seemed probably better at regiment or brigade command. That said, Wheeler definitely had better moments than Morgan had. I mean, once Morgan hits division command, it's hard to find a good decision he makes.
Yeah, I mean, he just has to invade the North by himself, so
Yeah.
that's pretty erratic at best. Um, all
I'll
right,
prove him the best. I'll have the longest, most crazy raid that's ever been pulled off in this war,
yeah, I mean, why not? YOLO.
know?
All right. Next up is someone who is rather controversial for some things he did after the war, especially Nathan Bedford Forrest.
Yes, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Fascinating man. Um, fascinating man. He really is a rags to riches story. But of course, how do you make his riches? Slave
Slavery.
trade, slave trade and plantations. And you keep that in mind. I mean, some of these guys on this list are slave owners, some are not. Some are more comfortable with slavery than others. Forrest sees as purely a financial transaction. And one must also keep in mind that being a slave trader in the Confederacy or just the South in general, it's a lucrative position. It gives you some status, but you also have a lot of critics because you're kind of seen as the used car salesman of the South. Right? Because if a slave's up for sale, then these slave sellers, like say Forrest, would lie about what they were good at or bad at or whatever, right?
Right.
So somebody like Forrest, when people at that time, especially the more gentlemanly ones, would hear that Forrest came from nothing and made his money with the slave trade, they might see him as a bit more beneath them, if you will. And to be fair, Forrest is not a super intelligent man. He's definitely the kind of guy who will tell you to go to hell to your face. Now, of all the Civil War generals on this list, the one I want on my side in a bar fight is Nathan Bedford Forrest every day of the week. He will personally kill 30 men during the war.
Whoa.
He'll have 31 horses shot from under him, last I've read. Wounded repeatedly. Here's one for you. One of his officers shot Forrest. They got into a dispute. He was a lieutenant. This guy shot Forrest. Forrest chased him down and knifed him to death. Well, knifed him, and then the guy died later. Apparently, Forrest yelled after the guy shot him, "No damn man kills me and lives."
Whoa.
This is a hard-bitten, hard-fighting man. This is a natural warrior. Okay? And I kind of see Forrest as, in many ways, being like Andrew Jackson in that sense. He is this kind of backwoods figure who, despite the adversity of his young life, makes a name for himself, and despite lacking formal military training, has a true knack for war, a natural warrior, if you will. Now, that said, the leading historian of the cavalry, at least in the Eastern Theater, is Eric J. Wittenberg, who, when asked who's the most overrated figure of the Civil War, says Nathan Bedford Forrest. Another guy, Dave Powell, who I'm friends with, he's a great Civil War historian. He will say something along somewhat similar lines, although not as harshly. So Forrest is a hard man to rate in this regard. If we're talking about somebody purely on a level of combat, Forrest is excellent. D.H. Hill, who himself is known for being hypercritical, said at Chickamauga that Forrest's men went into battle like infantry. And that's important because Forrest was training his men to fight like infantry when they needed to. So his cavalry force is one of the only ones that can go toe-to-toe with infantry and win, which he does at Bryce Crossroads. Bryce Crossroads is one of the most brilliantly conceived tactical victories of the war. It's Napoleonic in scale. Marat would have been happy. Forrest is good at raiding. He led several very successful raids into the Union rear, capturing garrisons, shelling boats, raising men on the way, and generally just raising hell. After the fall of Vicksburg, after Chickamauga, that is, Forrest was sent to West Tennessee, where he raised almost a brand new cavalry force. That's the one he used at Bryce Crossroads to be successful. So he's got some administrative skill, but Forrest has one big defect. A man this violent, this ill-tempered, and when I say ill-tempered, When they were retreating from Nashville after the Battle of Nashville, him and Cheatham got into an argument over who should cross the bridge first. Forrest apparently pulled his gun out on Cheatham, and Cheatham said, "Shoot me. I'm afraid of no man in the Confederacy." At that point, Cheatham's men apparently looked at Forrest and were like, "You shoot our general, we're going to shoot you." That's the kind of guy we're dealing with. The kind of guy who draws a gun on a fellow general when they're just trying to cross a bridge.
Good God.
Forrest is not good at getting along with others. He believes he is the meanest and the best fighter they have. And you know what? He's right.
Yeah, I know you've already mentioned like two other people, Wheeler and somebody else, who had major disagreements with Forrest and basically removed themselves from his presence.
Yeah. And that would include even supporters. I mean, Braxton Bragg supported Forrest's promotion to Major General, his appointment to the Cavalry Corps. And it should be noted that Forrest probably did not threaten Bragg's life after Chickamauga. That's the story that was told decades later, and we don't think it happened now. But definitely they had a bad relationship. Forrest just had a problem serving under other men because he believed he was the meanest, the sharpest, and the best fighter they had. So if you let Forrest go out on his own, he would do well. In fact, Bragg even said that. Bragg would say that, Forrest, you leave him on his own and let him do his own thing. He's much better at that. But when it came to working with his other officers, working with his army commanders, he just wasn't good. I would probably say the one he seemed to work the best with was Hood in Tennessee overall.
Because Hood liked to attack?
Maybe. I think what helped was that Forrest and Hood didn't serve together for too long in Tennessee. Hood attacked at Franklin. That failed. But then after that, Hood sent Forrest on his own, and Forrest captured some garrisons, raised a bit of hell. He did lose a battle, though, Overall Creek. Well, not really a battle, more like a big skirmish. But then during the retreat, Forrest was in charge of the rear guard, which several of Forrest's officers would say this was him at his best. And he was fantastic, defending the Army of Tennessee's rear while George Thomas and Wilson are chasing him. I think one of the key things is that Hood would actually ask Forrest's advice. And Hood, for maybe a day, considered making a stand at Columbia, Tennessee. And Forrest said, "General, we got to get out of here." And Hood said, "Yeah, you're right." So the only Army commander I know of that seemed to have served pretty well with him was him. Oh, another one would be Gideon J. Pillow at Fort Donelson. For some reason, Forrest and him got along pretty well.
Huh.
Goofy enough. Forrest defended him years later. That's because for all of Pillow's faults, Pillow was a fighter, and I think that's what Forrest would have respected with Pillow, at least. Of course, Forrest is controversial because after the war, he gets involved in the Ku Klux Klan. The degree and the extent of his involvement is still debated. He was not a founder of the Klan, though. That's much is known. His renouncing of the Klan is also debated. And the other thing that's debated, too, is one of his last public appearances was in 1875 or 76, where he actually argues that black people should be more accepted in the South and they should reduce racial strife. Now, some people have portrayed this as Forrest realizing the error of his ways and looking for some kind of reconciliation at the end of his life. Some people said that was simply a cold political tactic that was being used at the time to win some black votes for his particular people. I'm not going to jump in on that because I have not read a full-scale Major Forrest biography outside of That Devil Forrest, which is a good book, entertaining read, and pretty factual for the most part. It was written in the 1800s, but it doesn't really go into what Forrest did after the Civil War. So his post-war career is so controversial and charged and argued that I feel I cannot properly comment on it, except to say that when the war was over, Forrest, in the address to his men, said, "Be good citizens as you were good soldiers and seek peace." And obviously he didn't. He got involved in the Klan and was essentially part of that, arguably that low-intensity guerrilla war that was fought in the South after Reconstruction against the Reconstruction governments.
So, like what our friend Michael wrote his thesis on, the little war in Arkansas, the Brooks-Baxter War.
The Brooks-Baxter War. Now, Reconstruction is sometimes overly simplified into like a bunch of evil, racist, white Southern Democrats taking on heroic radical Republicans. I mean, that's a vast simplification. Numerous Republicans were willing to deal with Democrats at any moment or throw black voters under the bus. Other ones were committed to equal rights for black people and to broader reforms. So, I mean, there's a lot of variation within both groups. But yeah, I don't feel I can properly comment on Forrest post war. I just don't know enough. I will say that his activities, from what I have read, are not flattering, to say it mildly. Now, what about during the war? He becomes notorious for the Fort Pillow massacre. Well, it would appear that he did not order a massacre, but it also appears he did nothing to stop it once it happened. And therefore must take responsibility for what occurred there.
Yeah. I mean, that would be on
Yeah.
him as the commander to at least try to stop it.
Yeah. Now, there's some people say, oh, Forrest didn't know things. I'm like, yeah, I don't think so, man. I
Also,
mean,
with Forrest in general as a disciplinarian, how was he?
he's good. He's good. He's able to keep his men in line. He's good with subordinates. I mean, the subordinates would argue with him, of course. They could find him difficult too, but generally he was better working with subordinates than with superiors. It's hard to rate Forrest, man. He's really hard. Um, on the one hand, I don't particularly like the guy for what he did before the war. I know more about what he did before the war than after. So anybody who's involved in the slave trade and owns 2 plantations is knee deep in a pretty rotten system.
Yeah,
You know,
especially because it sounds like he wasn't really born into it. He, sought it out too, which I guess makes him worse in a lot of ways than a lot of these guys who were born into it.
yeah. You can make an argument for that for sure. But yeah, Forrest was he's definitely not a good man. But at the same time, we do have to at least respect men who are good as fighters. And Forrest is one hell of a fighter, you know. Uh, but at the same time, he doesn't work well with superiors, and that is very important. I think as a cavalry commander, I've got to give him a B.
Okay, sounds about right. I guess he's also called the Wizard of the Saddle, right? And then there's a sort of an urban
Yeah.
legend that's where the title Imperial Wizard comes from for the Ku Klux Klan.
Hell, I don't know, man. I don't know a lot about the Klan, honestly. And it can be hard to know things with the Klan. I mean, this was a secret society. It's so sometimes it's hard to know things, and it'd be hard to also read a history of the Klan that would be, how can I say this? Like, you're gonna have some history books, older ones might romanticize them. Current ones will, of course, damn them, which I completely understand. But I also think when you hate an organization a lot, it will blind you to understanding its appeal or some of the ways that it worked. Get what I'm trying to say?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
So I don't want to necessarily find somebody who's like dispassionate about it because that's probably a silly idea, but I'd want to find somebody who wouldn't necessarily have the biggest axe in the world to grind.
Right.
Because I think I mean, we all know that I mean, except unless you're like in the Klan or something, right?
Yeah.
We all know the Klan's this terrible organization that has done really bad stuff in American history. Not once, not twice, but during 3 historical periods: Reconstruction, during the 1920s, and civil rights. Now, I also think the Klan's influence in all 3 of those periods is overstated. For instance, the Klan of the 20s got very popular, but its popularity died off very quickly as well. Um, that said, how the Klan was able to rise and fall and some of its activities, I would want somebody who could tell me about that in a way that made me understand what made the thing tick, what made the thing work.
Right.
So I'll give you an example. Right now, apparently, the Klan is going into these places that are hit hard by um, opioid addiction, right? And they're not going in there and talking about black people and Jews and other stuff, right? What they're actually doing is just giving them help with addiction.
I didn't know that.
But this is a common tactic with any radical organization, right or left. If you really want to start gaining adherents, start doing them favors, like you know, the Black Panther Party, right?
Right.
I mean, Black Panther Party starts giving out free lunches. That's going to really scare the U.S. government, you know. Um, so if you're a radical right or left wing organization, one way to do that is just to provide stuff for people, you know.
I guess that makes
Uh,
sense because I remember back when Andrew Yang was still running, they ran hit pieces on him talking about how he's a white supremacist. And then they mentioned that he was concerned with the opioid crisis. And I was always puzzled by that claim, but I guess that must be the link that they tried to draw, is that the Klan says something about it, therefore it's a Klan issue.
well, I mean, it's an issue. I mean, who does it affect? It affects white people, typically males in the rural areas who vote Republican. I mean, you're in a hyper partisan age. I mean, the back of a lot of Democrats' minds is the more these people die on opioids, the fewer Republican voters we have.
Yeah.
I
So
mean, I mean, I say that, and that may sound like ridiculous, but you're talking. The Democratic Party is obsessed with demographics, right? So demographically, the opioid crisis favors them. You know, uh, I think that's playing with fire.
yeah, I
I
think
think
cheering for any kind of epidemic is probably not good on any level,
well,
even politically.
for them, it's less about cheering. It's almost kind of more like neglect. And if you want another example, I mean, think of the Reagan response to AIDS. I mean, what did Reagan care? Gay people don't vote for Republicans.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I mean, Reagan was notorious for that, and I guess Nixon was pretty notorious for being indifferent to any group that didn't vote Republican too.
It's a general thing. You in politics as anything else, you reward your friends and you punish your enemies, or you just ignore them, which can be as good as a punishment.
Yeah, or if you're Chris Christie, you close a bridge to send them a signal that you're the
Yeah.
man.
Oh yeah, exactly, man. Like, and the dispiriting thing is that this is very much a bipartisan thing. I mean, both sides are going to go there to you're going to punish your enemies and reward your friends. It does make a lot of sense on a personal level, like maybe like within the halls of Congress, right? It makes for some pretty rotten national policy.
Yeah, for sure.
So how we're handling the opioid epidemic right now, I think in some ways may be viewed the same way that, or at least I mean, may be viewed the same way as how the AIDS crisis was viewed, at least. That
Yeah, and
said, I mean, if you also think a certain group of people are just terrible and beyond the pale, then of course you won't necessarily care what happens to them. So, with Forrest, in summation, a lot of assessments of Forrest are based on emotional reactions to how terrible of a man he is. Um, but that said, it's very few historians of the Civil War who would tell you that Forrest was bad at his job. With the exception of working with others and working with an army, the man is a very effective, ruthless, and ferocious commander. All right. Um, and once again, if I'm in a bar fight and you have a Civil War general on my side, Nathan Bedford Forrest every day of the week.
yeah, I mean, at least he'll go down fighting. His guts will be hanging out, and he'll still be trying to get a hit in. So
Yeah, no, he is that guy. He is the guy who, while bleeding, is still coming at you.
actually, he really is like an attack dog. Territorial, vicious, and doesn't like outsiders, I guess.
Yeah.
But will fight really, really hard. So
Yeah.
he's like a vicious dog. One of the happiest days of my life, and I didn't want to celebrate in front of the neighbor when she told me, but there used to be a guy who lived next door who had a very vicious, huge fucking German Shepherd who tried to break through the fence once and murder me and my dog. And then she told me, yeah, my partner had a heart attack several months ago and so had to put his dog to sleep. And I didn't want to say like yes, but that's what I was thinking because I fucking hated that dog so much. Uh, but anyway, yeah, and Nathan Bedford Forrest is basically a German Shepherd. That's what I was trying to get at here.
Yeah, I get. No, I hear you, man.
A
I
very
mean,
poorly trained German Shepherd, I guess, or one who never got enough love as a puppy.
yeah. Hey, but you say that, children and women loved him.
Really?
Yeah, well, I kind of call this the Daryl Strawberry effect. And what I mean is that, Daryl Strawberry?
He was a baseball player. That's about all I know about him.
Yeah, he's a baseball player with the Mets in the 1980s, won a World Series with them. So Daryl Strawberry has this like reputation as one of like the meanest baseball players ever, but a lot of people said they liked him, but I read a whole book about when the Mets won called The Bad Guys Won. Very good book, fun read. But anyway, the people who liked him tend to be like, people who like were the bat boys, the ones who worked behind the scenes, the people below him, right? So I feel like Forrest is the kind of guy who was going to be, nice to people who he considered below his station, right? But if he thought you were his equal or you were above him because you outranked him, that's where a lot of the difficulties arise. You
Uh,
know? Yeah.
so, which you would think, based on that, though, if he applied that equally, that he would have been a lot kinder to black people.
Yeah, I don't know too much about that. I know Forrest had slaves with him who held his horses, and there's some evidence that a few of them like took part in the Battle of Chickamauga, but I'm not a Chickamauga expert. And I don't know enough about that to corroborate it. I will say this though. I do know about this. One of the guys on Forrest's staff in 1864 to 65 was named George Washington Cable. He was a corporal. Now, Cable is a New Orleans native. He joined the Confederacy, the Confederate Cavalry, after the fall of New Orleans. Cable wrote out the manumission papers for forced slaves at the end of the war. Now, at that point, it's purely symbolic. The war is over. Your slaves are going to be freed. 13th Amendment's already being passed. So it's a symbolic act, but it's interesting because Cable, after the war, became an advocate for civil and equal rights for black people and, voting rights and all the rest. And this got into a lot of trouble in the South. And he eventually got chased out of New Orleans, especially as segregation took hold. So it's always interesting to me that this man who's considered one of the most notorious racists in American history had on his staff in the war one of the biggest racial progressives of the late 1800s.
Wow.
Yeah. And it is possible that Forrest might have had more complicated views on individual slaves, but I can't really speak to that. And in the end, the guy's involved in the slave trade. So, even if he was like, decent for a slave master to people that he personally owned, he sure as hell wasn't decent to people that he was selling all over the Tennessee and Mississippi River Valley.
Yeah, I
You
guess
know?
if we were ranking them on individual virtue, we'd have to create a tier below F for him, most likely.
Yeah, yeah. The thing about it too is like one thing I've found reading about people like Forrest though is that you could be racist and hate a whole group of people, but be nice to certain individuals, right?
Right.
And you'll think that, because I'm nice to like, Larry down the street, I can't possibly hate black people, right? Because I like Larry.
Right.
Sometimes get that feeling with Forrest, although I don't know enough about that aspect. I know more about him strictly in the military sense. And now that I'm saying this, I feel like I need to like find 2 or 3 good Forrest biographies and really dive in. And I think what I'd like to find is probably one that's sympathetic and defensive, and then one that is as critical and harsh as possible. And not that the truth is in between the two, but I want to see how they'll stack up against each other. The
Right.
only Forrest book I have is a purely military book, which is a very good one, by the way. It's got the most maps in any Civil War book I've ever read. I think it's I call it like I don't have the book, I don't have the title on me right now, but it's a good book. A great resource for Forrest campaigns. Those maps are amazing. The guy literally tells you how to get to every site for every fight that Forrest was ever in. Like, take this road and go here, and it's going to look like this.
So, for all of you out there listening, that is your homework. Find Sean 2 differing biographies of Nathan Bedford Forrest, and then post the titles in the comments.
And ones that are not just like military, I've got that covered. Okay.
Yes, especially if it focuses on the post-war period, then that's your assignment, guys. So, I know you don't have much better to do if you're listening to this right now, so you have time to do this. Go get it done.
Yeah, we're on lockdown. I mean, you have no idea. I mean, how much like research I'm getting done online right now?
Yeah, it actually has affected my research negatively just a little bit because there are certain print books that I can't get access to that don't exist online. Um, so also, I'm having to prepare for a Latin exam right now, and normally I'd want to have a full Latin text to study from, but I can't access that except online, and it's a lot less convenient. But I guess for certain things, maybe it can be beneficial just to have all this free time, but it's actually kind of dicking me over a little bit.
Interesting, man. I'm doing great with it outside the fact that I'm unemployed right now.
Yeah, that's always a downer for sure.
Yeah, I mean, but I mean, eventually this will end, and then hopefully get back on the stuff. But we'll get back to. Sorry, let's get back to some generals, eh?
All right, we got three more to go. Next up is Fitzhugh Lee, who I believe was a nephew of Robert E. Lee.
Hello.
Hello? Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, yeah, yeah. A nephew of Robert E. Lee. Yes, yes. Fitzhugh Lee was Jeb Stuart's favorite. He was a very affable guy, charismatic. It's actually one of the reasons why both he and Stephen D. Lee became presidents of the United Confederate Veterans. Now, Stephen Lee, when he was head of the Confederate Veterans, was very big on reconciliation. I'm not saying Fitzhugh Lee wasn't, but Fitzhugh Lee was very big on lost cause and especially deifying Robert E. Lee, naturally. Now, as a cavalry commander, he was pretty good, but he already started to show cracks in early 1863. He didn't do too well at a little scrap called Kelly's Ford. And he eventually becomes a cavalry division commander. Jeb Stuart died, and Robert E. Lee couldn't pick between Fitzhugh and Wade Hampton. Those were Stuart's top two lieutenants. He knew that both of them had supporters in the thing, and they both were kind of rivals and had an awkward relationship. So Lee didn't want to appoint anybody at first, but then at the Battle of Trevelyan Station, Fitzhugh Lee didn't do very well during that one. Also something called Wilson's Wharf. Wilson's Wharf was when Fitzhugh Lee was sent to attack a small fortified position near, not too far from Richmond. And this position was held by a brigade of USCT, that is United States Colored Troops. These are black soldiers. They're led by Edward Wild. Edward Wild is one of your few Union generals who is a full-on abolitionist. All right? Definitely believes in equality. So it's not just it's not just opportunism. He's a true believer. Most famously, he actually had a local plantation owner whipped in what he called poetical justice. So Bragg, who at that time was in Richmond, goes to Fitzhugh Lee and says, hey, this guy's been raiding the countryside, freeing slaves. He whipped this guy named Compton. We need you to take him out. So Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry surrounds Wilson's Wharf, and he tells Wild, I outnumber you. I'm going to attack. But if you surrender now, he says, I will treat your men as soldiers. Now understand, at this time, a lot of black soldiers being captured, if they're not getting murdered, they're being re-enslaved or being used by one of the armies. But he's telling him, I will treat them as soldiers, so prisoners of war. Now, whether Fitzhugh Lee is just lying through his teeth or not, I can't say on that one. I will say that Beauregard was one of the men who supported treating captured black soldiers as soldiers and not simply just re-enslaving them.
Huh.
That's for a lot of reasons. Beauregard's one of the only Confederate generals who after the war will advocate equal rights as well, although he didn't do it for very long. That's a whole other story. But point is, Beauregard he's from Southeast Louisiana. He's a different cat. But Fitzhugh Lee then tells Wild, I will not be held responsible for what happens if I got to storm your position. That sounds at first vicious, but that was kind of standard practice for fortified positions, was to say, hey, if I got to storm your place, I don't know what's going to happen when that happens. But Wild understands the threat and says, I'll take it, take my chances. Fitzhugh Lee attacks. His men lose like 200 soldiers. Wild loses like 25 men. So Lee was humiliated there. Then he was humiliated at Trevelyan Station. Robert E. Lee puts Wade Hampton in charge until the last few months of the war. Wade Hampton gets transferred to the Army of Tennessee to command their cavalry. Fitzhugh Lee then ascends, and of course he gets involved in the fish fry with Pickett and Rosser. He didn't really show. I mean, to be fair, he really comes in. He's really getting higher rank when the Confederate cavalry is on the decline, but he didn't really show any particular brains or skill. He's probably really just more or less a subordinate than anything else. I'm going to rate Fitzhugh Lee an E.
Okay. How much of his position did he owe to the fact that he was Lee's nephew?
A decent amount. He also did have a genuine friendship with Jeb Stuart. Now, to be fair, Jeb Stuart was one of Robert E. Lee's favorites before the Civil War. So Stuart was going to have a high position under Lee no matter what. And so what I'm trying to say is I don't think Stuart courted Fitzhugh Lee because he's like, oh, I got to get in good with his dad. I think Jeb Stuart's like, I'm already good with it. No, I'm not sorry, his uncle. He's like, I'm already good with his uncle. They got along really well. And Fitzhugh Lee was like a fun guy. He ran a fun camp, Music was always playing. Probably of all the generals on this list, while I'm not rating him too highly as a commander, he's one of the ones you probably could hang out with more easily. Like, I'm not hanging out with Forrest. Are you hanging out with Forrest?
Fuck no.
Hell
I don't
no.
want to get shot.
What about Wheeler? He can't tell a joke. You want to hang out with him?
Well, no, not particularly.
Yeah. Now, everybody kind of agreed that Fitzhugh Lee could be a little arrogant and fussy, but he was genuinely a pretty affable guy,
Yeah, I mean, I guess that can help some to relieve tension in camp.
Yeah.
Whatnot. Our next person is a guy who sometimes I fuck up his name by reversing it, but his name is Wade Hampton from South Carolina.
Name is Wade Hampton. I want to say, is he Wade Hampton the third or the fourth?
I don't know.
Yeah, Wade Hampton's one of his ancestors fought with Lee's father in the Revolution at Eutaw Springs outside of Charleston. Wade Hampton is, by some accounts, the largest slave owner in the South with 400 slaves. Purebred aristocrat of the South. Raises a group called Hampton's Legion with his own money, so he's also, of course, he's a big slave owner, so of course he's wealthy. Wade Hampton is one of those guys who has a natural aptitude for war. He commands an infantry brigade pretty effectively, gets transferred to the cavalry, achieves a reputation for competence and ability. His real high point is Trevelyan Station. He wins that battle, and that is the biggest cavalry battle of the Civil War, and he wins it. After that, Lee says, okay, Hampton, you're in charge. And Hampton's in charge of Jeb Stuart's cavalry when it's on the decline. But he's able to pull off some raids. His cavalry has some success. One of those famous raids is the Beefsteak Raid. That's where they stole thousands of cattle from the Union Army, which Abraham Lincoln called the slickest bit of cattle rustling I ever heard of. Yeah,
I guess it kind of was.
Yeah, no, Hampton was a very, very effective commander. I rate him an A.
Right.
He was good at working with others. He was good at scouting and screening, and he is good in a scrap too. He can hold his own in a cavalry fight, or even if he has cavalry against infantry. He's good at both things.
So also, didn't he have 3 or 4 sons, and all of them were killed in the war?
Ooh, I don't know about that. I know Hardee lost one of his sons, but I don't know about that with Hampton. I did read the Hampton biography a few years ago. Hampton's post-war activities are interesting. He eventually became governor of South Carolina. Hampton, of course, opposed Reconstruction, and he turned a blind eye towards some violence at the polls when he was elected. However, there's a guy named Martin Gary. He was a South Carolina cavalry officer too, and Martin Gary is a hardcore Southern rights, I'm opposed to Reconstruction guy. And Gary got angry at Hampton because once Hampton became governor of South Carolina, to Gary's shock, he actually advocated racial reconciliation. Hampton, for instance, increased funding for black schools and opened up black schools. And as such, he got a decent amount of black votes when he ran for governor the second time.
Huh.
when Hampton dies, the pro-segregation forces in South Carolina did everything to subvert him because he was opposed to the early segregation laws. The thing about Hampton is that he believed in paternalism. And what that would mean is that, what that would mean in so many words is that as long as black people are voting for me, I will do them favors so they keep voting for me. That's what it means in Reconstruction politics. So a part of Reconstruction Southern politics, I'm sorry, not even Reconstruction, at this point we're talking 1880s, 1890s, is you have people like Wade Hampton or Francis T. Nichols in Louisiana who do things for black voters to get their votes, which means their opponents, in the case of Hampton, one of his big opponents would be Pitchfork Ben Tillman. His opponent's view on it is that if I can get black people to not vote, that will defeat my political rivals. So it's both racism and political strategy as well. A great book that discusses this, by the way, is called Pistols and Politics, and it's about political violence in some of the Louisiana parishes, and that's what it was a fight over. It was a fight between those politicians who wanted black people to have the right to vote because they were voting for them, and then those who wanted to take away the black people's right to vote, both out of racism, but also because it would defeat their political foes.
So it literally is the same as voter suppression today, then?
How do you mean?
Well, I mean, Republicans always try to, purge the rolls, or what did they call it? Fix the rolls, and
yeah,
then,
yeah.
Democrats always have the voter drives, because they always do it in neighborhoods they tend to win percentage-wise, and never in
Yes,
places where they don't
yes.
win.
That's a good point to make. And the other similarity too is that while a guy like Nichols or Hampton will do things for black people, and I'll give Hampton credit, he did more than most. Same thing with William Mahone in Virginia, another Confederate general. But in the end, it's relatively speaking crumbs, right? And we get an argument for that as well. How much does the Democratic Party do for black people in America? That's a whole other argument to be made. Certainly, the Republican Party doesn't do them too many favors, but the Democratic Party,
At least once we get past the civil rights era, yeah, I mean, not a lot.
Yeah, I mean, some of it will vary from region to region. I can just tell you in New Orleans, black people were made up the impoverished of New Orleans my entire life. We've had a succession of black mayors and legislators and city councilmen, and there's really been no improvement. But that's because class can be found with black people as easily with anybody else, right?
Exactly.
Which is an argument. Which, by the way, is an argument made by Adolph Reed, who's a political scientist and thinker. He's actually from New Orleans. He's a good man. You should read some of his stuff.
Yeah,
but anyway,
actually, I just discovered him not long ago through a podcast I listened to, and I'm definitely planning to read his book Class Notes at some point.
No, I haven't read too much about what I've read. He's a sharp analyst, and one of his arguments too, by the way. I know we're getting into politics, but we're talking about Hampton. He's a major politician.
And when we're talking about the politics of the South, it's basically race politics and class.
It's going to be race and class. I mean, the same thing with the North, though. I mean, the North had its own race politics, right? That's the thing. That's the thing that's annoys about the Civil War is that the North has always used the South as this way to essentially, I don't want to say, in many cases absolve their racism, ignore their racism. But I mean, I've lived up North. There's racism there for sure. It's of a different variety, But anyway, so actually, I lost my train of thought on that. Well, no, I was saying we're talking about a bit about contemporary politics, but that's because Wade Hampton is a major politician after the war. And you'll find a lot of these Confederate cavalry guys do get involved in politics. One of the reasons is because they're young. I mean, Lee was old, man. He died in 1870. A lot of those guys like Joseph E. Johnston, he didn't get involved in politics. He's too old. He's kind of worn out, But somebody like Hampton, I mean, he's still a young man when the war ends. He's got his life ahead of him,
Yeah, and I guess, too, the rigors of going through the war would have been a lot easier to recover from a young man as opposed to an older guy. So imagine someone like a Lee or a Johnston would have, been in much better shape going in the 1870s if they hadn't fought the war.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Hampton, I rate an A. I think he was a very effective commander. as a post-war politician, his career is controversial but also complicated. Um, he doesn't fulfill that because there's a stereotype of Reconstruction ended and black people's rights were taken away, and that didn't happen right away. There were people like Hampton who were making a case against that, but they failed. The rising tide of scientific racism, in particular, overwhelmed them.
Yeah, you mentioned Mahone just a minute ago. I wanted to put him on something, even though I couldn't find a reason, just because I wanted to make the comment that William Mahone looks like a mix of Yosemite Sam and the Macho Man Randy Savage.
It
So I
does.
just thought I'd throw that out there because that was my grand observation about him.
Oh yeah, he's a tiny man too. He's like very. You can tell like his uniform fits on him very loosely. He was a very small man. Very effective commander, especially late in the war. But that one of the things that helped out William Mahone was he knew the terrain south of Petersburg so well he could use it to his advantage.
And also being smaller, harder to hit.
So our last guy on here is probably the most famous one outside of Nathan Bedford Forrest, and that'd be Jeb Stuart.
If anything, I'd say Jeb Stuart's probably more famous, right?
It depends. I mean, they're both pretty famous, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think he's probably a little less controversial, though.
Oh yeah, I mean, he was charming, dashing man. He's deeply religious too. Even though he's beloved by ladies and good at dances. There's no evidence of him being like a philanderer, so he's not an Earl Van Dorn type or anything like that, you know. Um, Stuart started off the war commanding a cavalry regiment at First Bull Run, where he actually led a true blue cavalry charge. So he gets a name for himself very early on. He did the ride around McClellan, of course. He does various raids for Lee. He fights the Battle of Brandy Station, where he was a bit surprised, but in the end, he recovered and won the battle. Successfully screened Lee's army during the first and second invasions of the North until he cut loose from Lee and went on that raid that didn't do any good and deprived Lee of his what he called his eyes and ears. Now, the degree to which that's Stuart's fault is debatable. The orders that Lee gave had some vagueness to them, for sure. So it's unfair to blame Stuart for Gettysburg necessarily. Lee made his own bed there. But it should be noted that's probably the only time that Lee ever complained about Stuart in any capacity. Stuart proved to be an inspiring leader. He was good in a fight. He was great at scouting and screening. His administration of his command was good. He won most of the fights he was involved in. And most importantly, he worked very, very well with Lee. Very well. And that's why when a lot of people, especially as a kid, would go like, oh, Forrest was better than Stuart because I think that's actually something I want to get to with Forrest in a minute here. But, they'd be like, oh, Forrest is better than Jeb Stuart. I thought, no, Jeb Stuart can actually work with other people.
Yeah, that kind of helps a little bit. Especially when your main job is to support the army.
He's not a vicious son of a bitch, I give Stuart an A. I believe he is the best cavalry commander the Confederates have and maybe the best of the war. I won't make a hard and fast decision on that until we go through the Union guys, but if he's not the best, he's the second best.
All right, sounds fair enough. I mean, I guess Jeb stands for, was it John Ewell Brown or something like that?
That was James Ewell Brown, but yeah, Jeb being his kind of nickname from that abbreviation, I want to get back to one thing about Forrest though that I've noticed.
Sure.
Like, I've visited Shiloh Battlefield a few times, been in that area, right? And when you're in that area, you'll still see people who will speak fondly of Forrest, right? And naturally, there's a bit of racism. There's quite a bit of racism involved with that. There's also, I think, with Forrest, you got people who live in like a rural part of the South. Forrest was a rural Southerner and self-made man who showed up a bunch of Union guys, Northerners, right? So I think the thing to understand about Forrest's appeal in the Southern backwoods is that this is a guy who rags to riches and showed up the Yankees. And People in the South may or may not feel one way about black people sometimes, right? And we have our problems with race. But I can tell you, go in those backwoods, they definitely don't like Yankees, and they will tell you that.
Yeah, even in the more, because I remember the area my parents retired to, Western North Carolina. It's interesting how much anti-Northern sentiment there is, especially given how many New Yorkers end up settling down in North Carolina. To the point was probably like 1 in every 10 people was born in New York. Um, but anyway, I was in a subway once, and there was this guy there who was saying, "The greatest pleasure I get in life is dressing up in my Confederate uniform and shooting the goddamn Yankees. But I can't handle the excitement anymore because my heart's bad."
I still run into people in New Orleans, man. Like, hell, I mean, like, I'm in New Orleans. Most people around here left progressive, and they'll complain about carpetbaggers. You know,
Yeah.
it's still some of that regional thing. I think that is a part of Forrest's appeal that isn't commented on by people, especially people not from here. People haven't been to those areas. You know that. To them, Forrest, the self-made man who showed up the hated Yankees repeatedly and didn't give up. I remember you talking about that. My dad liked Lee, but he really liked Forrest, and that was one of the reasons why. Because he's like, Lee surrendered. Lee said seek peace. He said Forrest said go to hell. He liked that.
Yeah, I guess to be fair though, your dad seems to have some rather out there views on a few things.
Yeah, he's mellowed out in his old age, But yeah, that's something worth keeping in mind too. A little aside here, you know, there are many ways to view some of these figures, especially the larger than life ones like a Grant, a Sherman, a Forrest, and a Lee, right? And with Forrest, people can emphasize either the racism, the Ku Klux Klan, the slave trading, or they'll emphasize like the you know military prowess the man had, or the one I'm talking about where they emphasize that like never die, never quit mentality. I also mention that never die, never quit mentality because with Robert E. Lee, I find there's three different types of Lees there are. There is the traitorous Lee who should have been hanged after the war. There's the Lee who was an honorable man and fought to defend his home of Virginia, but once the war is over, once he knows it's over, he chooses honorable peace and encourages reconciliation and encourages the South to rebuild itself. But there's also the battle commander who repeatedly defeated a superior Union enemy and was only defeated in the end by overwhelming numbers. And for somebody like my dad, the last one was the Lee that he liked. Not the reconciliation Lee, for sure.
Right. And
Yeah.
also, I guess a lot of the Longstreet bashing that occurred in the late 19th century is because he was a reconciliation guy.
Yeah, not just a reconciliation guy. Like Lee was a reconciliation guy, but he would still say things like, maybe like black people shouldn't have the right to vote, but have equal civil rights or something, right? Which, by the way, was kind of Lincoln's position, at least from what I've read. Lincoln's position was he was apparently against black suffrage, at least before in the early part of the war, but for civil rights, Which I don't know how you can sustain civil rights without suffrage, but I'm not getting into that. Somebody like Longstreet is for black people voting. Now, a lot of that was also because Longstreet wanted to use them to his political advantage, But another thing about Longstreet, too, is that he would criticize Lee's generalship. Now, this is got to be careful on this one. I say this, the Lost Cause people would depict it as Longstreet was critical of Lee. He was not. He thought Lee was one of the best commanders he had ever served under. In fact, he named one of his sons Robert E. Lee. That was the guy's name, Robert E. Lee Longstreet. So if you asked him, he would actually, this is what he's literally said one time. He's like, I'm not saying Lee was a bad general. He was very good. He was one of the best commanders we had, along with Joseph E. Johnston. But the man made mistakes. That's what Longstreet would say.
Yeah, I mean,
Uh,
I guess that seems like a perfectly reasonable position.
well, hey, man, I mean, you could say something like Grant right now. I know one historian who was talking about Grant's flaws, and the guy accused him of being a lost cause racist.
Wow.
Yeah, because if you're against Grant, you must really wish the Confederates had won, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's no way that he had flaws and shortcomings or anything like that.
Or what you do is when you mention the flaws, you do it in a very gentle way. Get what I'm trying to say? Like they do that. They'll mention some flaws, but they'll be very gentle about it. And it's hard to be dispassionate about any of these people, but I personally don't try to pick a side in rating their military abilities. I can pick a side personality wise, right?
Yeah,
Um, you can say that I like this guy's personality, not that one, but try to be as dispassionate as possible with somebody's military abilities. So yeah, for instance, Nathan Bedford Forrest, pretty bad human being, really good fighter, right?
right.
Fitzhugh Lee, I'm not going to say. I mean, first time. I mean, nowadays, he'd probably be considered, of course, like a racist and all the rest. First time though, he's a pretty relaxed guy. Seemed enjoyable. Doesn't mean he was a good general.
Yeah.
He might have been good. Seems like he was good around a campfire, though.
Yeah, if you need to roast some marshmallows over fish fry, he's the guy to go to.
Exactly. The roster's like, "Hey, you want to eat some fish?" He's like, "Isn't there a war going on? Wait, what am I saying? Let's eat some fish."
Yeah, and Pickett's like, all right, I'm in. That's still
Oh,
that's probably the best story of the Civil War, or at least the best one you've told so far.
it's one of my 5 or 10 favorites, man. Also, Van Dorn getting gunned down is a good one. And actually, the Forrest killing that one officer who shot him and then he knifed the guy is a good one too. I forgot to mention that while that guy was dying, Forrest went over his body, held his hand, and they like forgave each other. And I think one account Forrest started crying. You
What?
know, well, I mean, this is an emotionally unstable individual. You know.
God, dude. Yeah, man. It sounds like Forrest can't possibly have enough biographies because this guy is a mess of contradictions.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think that's why people still keep going back to him.
I feel like yeah,
He also,
if we're in the modern age where people actually diagnose mental illnesses, I mean, he would need a whole team of psychologists to figure him out.
yeah, definitely. I mean, we barely even talked about Stuart, right? Stuart, he has interesting stories. He's a very flamboyant guy. He had that great hat with the feather in it and all the rest. But I mean, Stuart doesn't come across as a violent mental patient, right?
Right. I mean, people actually liked him. I think he had held dances in camp, and he would flirt with young women as they traveled around places, including in the north or whatever. But nothing happened that was distasteful or terrible.
Yeah, it's funny you mention like yeah. Forrest, as far as I know, didn't really do much of that kind of stuff. That doesn't mean the men didn't have some fun in camp, right? But you don't really run to stories of Forrest's men like having a gay old time, right?
Yeah.
Like, sorry, quoting the Flintstones intro there. Um, one fun fact about it though, we're going through a lot of these generals, and I had ancestors north and south. But probably one of the most interesting ones was a guy who joined up with Forrest in 1864 and fought with him from Bryce Crossroads all the way to the very end of the war. Was captured in like the last Forrest's last battle. He was captured in his last battle, Selma. Um, so interesting story with that one. I mentioned that one too because almost all of my Confederate ancestors deserted.
Yeah, this I know in my family pretty much all of them were Confederates, but because my family's from North Carolina originally, I mean, I imagine like a lot of people, they weren't super into the war. And I know there is one story in the family, I've never been able to confirm it, that three of the sons fought for the Confederacy. One fought for the Union, actually. And then when he came home, his dad, who had also been drafted and then sent to the coast to be a garrison guy, supposedly shot him and killed him when he came home.
Wow.
Yeah, again, I can't confirm the story though. I don't know exactly what I'd need to do to confirm that.
That would be a very hard one. I'll tell you the one that happened with me. I was told by my grandfather in the vaguest of terms that he was like, some of your ancestors fought both sides, but the ones that were closest to fought for the Confederacy. He said, but they left because they said they were fighting to defend their homes. And these guys are from Kentucky. And so they joined up when part of Kentucky was Confederate. They were at Fort Donelson and surrendered there. The Fort Donelson men are eventually exchanged. They get sent to Mississippi. They're in camp. And they promoted all of them to sergeant, apparently. And I looked at the records, and they all just left within the same week of each other, except for like two of them. Well, all but one. Now, the one who stays behind was at Vicksburg. He escaped from the garrison and was rewarded from escaping from the siege with like a new horse, a new uniform, and was assigned to the staff of an officer to serve as a courier. He then took the new horse he had and rode back to Kentucky.
Wow.
Yeah. And what Grandpa said was that they signed up to defend their homes, and they found they were not defending their homes. But he didn't say Fort Donelson. He said they were at Shiloh, and then they deserted after that. No, it was Fort Donelson, and then they were in Mississippi, and they didn't fight a battle in Mississippi. They just said, okay, we're out, The one I told you served at Forrest was one of the guys who deserted. His name was George Washington Dossett. And then when Forrest did a Kentucky raid, he joined back up with him. So,
wow.
Who knows, man? But I found a papers. The state of Kentucky provided him with a military pension.
Yeah.
Later in life. Yeah. So anyway, man, there's some family stuff for you. I know this was a more rambling and, like a lot of the sides and tangents on this one.
Well, I mean, the thing is, everybody's going stir crazy, one, and two, I guess, with the cavalry, sometimes you make some raids, you're a little bit away from, the area of interest sometimes, but that's okay.
Yeah, I think also because a lot of these guys had those controversial and interesting post-war careers. And actually, it's the same thing with the Union. We're going to talk about some guys who burned some Indian villages.
Yeah. Yeah, that's, I guess that was a front they had to deal with a lot more than the Confederates. And then, of course, after the war, a lot of the Union guys.
Well, I do wonder when people might start removing statues of guys like Sherman.
I wouldn't be surprised if it happened within the next 10 years.
Think so? With the kind of stuff that Sherman and Sheridan and Custer and the rest of them, what they did?
Actually, I guess one of the things that might be protecting them right now is like you were talking about the Grant fanboydom, because those guys were Grant's right hand,
Yeah, it also helps that they beat up the Confederates in the South, and since the South keeps voting Republican, I mean, every Democrat in the country hates the South. Well, not every Democrat, but bashing the South is a very easy thing for Democrats to do,
Yeah.
And those guys, they fucked up the South. So, but at the same time, they really fucked up some indigenous tribes, And I guess that's one of the reasons why the idea of like a heroic, virtuous North conquering all before it is, to me, just a lie people tell themselves to feel good about it, Or as my dad one time said, after they got done with the Confederacy, they did it to the natives. That's what he said. That's what he told me about Sherman and Sheridan.
Yeah, if anything, I think Sherman was a little bit harsher to the natives than to the Confederates. And by a little bit, I mean massively so. Yeah.
But anyway, everybody, that's a discussion for a different time when we get into some of the Union cavalry officers. They're not quite as dynamic or dashing as some of these Confederates, and they actually have quite a few knuckleheads. But they also have some guys who are very good, and by the end of the war, their cavalry is supreme.
Yep, and there also will be a few more of them than the Confederates. I have 17 of them on that list, so that one...
what's our Confederate list at?
13.
That's right. I want to add one more general who I thought of.
Well, good thing we added an extra person here.
Yeah, Stand Watie.
Stand Watie. Oh, yeah, that guy. He's Native American, right?
Cherokee.
Yeah.
Indian Territory, what is today Oklahoma, is divided by the Civil War, fights its own personal Civil War. Several of the native tribes there owned slaves. Now, that's something to be kept in mind. Lots of native tribes had owned slaves over the generations. Like, for instance, De La Salle, the French explorer who reached the mouth of the Mississippi River and claimed it for France, right? He had some native scouts with him who brought some of their own slaves with them. Yeah. Natives would attack other tribes and then sell them off into slavery to their allies. So if you were a Choctaw and get captured by the Chickasaw would sell off to the British, and vice versa. The Choctaw might capture a Chickasaw and sell them off to the French. You know, there's a whole book about that one I read about essentially the Native American slave trade, which was bigger in the southeast United States. Anyway, point is that Oklahoma Territory, there are Native Americans there who own slaves. Stand Watie is one of them. So a lot of them decide to back the Confederates. The idea being that, hey, we're fellow slave owners. Also, the U.S. government is the one who threw us here. Maybe the Confederates will cut us a better deal. A large contingent of Native Americans will fight at the Battle of Pea Ridge. They don't do too well, though. Stand Watie mostly fought in Indian Territory. He was a very good scout and raider. He did not fight in a lot of pitched battles, but he was essentially on his own and then eventually became a general in the Confederacy. He is, by some accounts, the last Confederate general to surrender. Now, he's a bit hard to rate. He never commanded anything more than a brigade. He didn't fight in a ton of battles, but he was pretty good at what he was doing. And actually, in his early efforts, Indian Territory for the first 2 years of the war is mostly Confederate controlled. I'm going to rate Watie a B.
Really?
Yeah, while he wasn't too severely tested, at least, while he wasn't tested in like a grand command the way that a guy like Forrest was, he did show a lot of aptitude for what he was doing out west. And keep in mind, too, I mean, this is a guy fighting on a shoestring, right? And it's with good reason that he's one of, if not one of the last Confederates to surrender. Not as in a remote area, but he was a hard guy to track down. You know?
Right.
So, pretty effective commander. Argument can be made B or C, I would say, but not lower than C.
Okay.
All right. Before we conclude this off, you got any questions, Derek?
Let's say there's a bar fight between Nathan Bedford Forrest and Napoleon General Van Dam. Both of them have had half a bottle of whiskey. Who wins?
So we got Napoleon, Van Dam, and Forrest?
No. Just Van Dam versus Forrest one-on-one bar fight.
Oh. Man, I don't know how good Van Dam was in like a brawl.
I mean, he looks like he would be a guy who got in a few, though.
Yeah, you know who would definitely be good at fighting Forrest from that one? Two guys I could think of. One would be, and I'm going to butcher the guy's pronunciation, Augereau.
Augereau?
Yeah. Augereau was known for bar fighting, and he was an accomplished fencer and swordmaster. That was kind of his reputation. He kind of already had a bit of a reputation before the French Revolution even started as a drill master, a sword master, and a womanizer. Of course, you know, because half of Napoleon's generals are just chasing women all the time.
Yeah, like Massena has the two courtesans with him on campaign.
Yeah. Another one is Thomas Alexandre Dumas. He was the Black Cavalry commander. He was from Haiti, and he was commanded Napoleon's cavalry in Egypt, and he served in Italy as well. But he was commander of the cavalry in Egypt. Dumas was a very, very large, powerful man, like big, strong, and was known for his prowess in battle as well. So if there's any two cavalry commanders I think of off the top of my head who could take on Forrest, those two could do it. I don't know about Van Dam. Maybe. I mean, I remember Napoleon said if he had to invade hell, Van Dam would lead the vanguard, you know?
Right.
Well. Yeah, I think Forrest might beat Van Dam, but I think Forrest might lose to those other two, you know? Actually, him and Dumas, that would be a really good grudge match there, you know?
Yeah, it could be interesting. I imagine it would be hard to keep them apart from one another, given Forrest's attitude, and then I guess Dumas' willingness to fight anybody too.
Yeah. And of course, Dumas was the father of the novelist,
right? Who wrote was it The Hunchback or Les Miserables?
No, Count de Monte Cristo. You're thinking of Victor Hugo.
There we go. Yeah, got my French writers confused.
Yeah, Dumas, like Three Musketeers, that kind of stuff.
Ah, yes.
So No, that's pretty much it for me. Hope everybody enjoyed the little analysis and didn't mind all the sides and the getting into some more questions of morality involving some of these gentlemen, particularly Mr. Nathan Bedford. Um,
Yeah,
anything else, Derek?
no, that's
Good.
all I can think of. That's all we got for you tonight. I guess we'll have to figure out when we want to do the Union guys. We can talk about that after the video.
Probably next week. I like doing this as a once a week thing.
All right, sounds good to me. All right,
Everybody,
well, good night, everybody. We'll see you later.
bye bye.